In the wilds of North America, survival is a fight against nature's deadliest predators. When faced with nature's fiercest creatures, some fight back with all their strength and come on top, but others can't escape the brutal attacks. These stories will grip you, leave you on the edge of your seat, and haunt you. It was early morning when the call came in. The gentle morning light barely pierced the thick mist that hung over the town of East Glacier, Montana. Fish and wildlife officers Drew Adams and Sarah Pierce had spent years responding to reports of bears straying too close to human settlements. Still, there was something unusual about this particular call. The witness claimed the grizzly was unlike any they had ever seen, so huge it loomed over the trees. Bears this large were rare, if not unheard of. Drew and Sarah knew they needed to investigate immediately. They drove toward the reported location, scanning the dense forest that closed in around them. The air was thick with the earthy scent of damp pine needles, the morning chill seeping through a cracked window. Drew, a rugged man in his early 40s with years of experience tracking predators, kept his eyes locked on the trail ahead, his grip firm on the steering wheel. Beside him, Sarah, younger but just as capable, checked her rifle, her movements methodical. They had dealt with aggressive bears before, but nothing about the reports felt routine. When they reached the area, they stepped out cautiously, their boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The forest was quiet, as if every living creature had chosen to stay hidden. Then, through the thinning mist, they saw it. An enormous shape hunched over a carcass, its massive shoulders rippling with raw power as it tore into the flesh of its kill. The grizzly was far larger than any bear they had ever seen. Its dark fur was streaked with blood. It dwarfed the fallen animal beneath it, its immense paws easily ripping through sinew and bone. Drew took charge of the situation. He motioned for Sarah to stay close, and their every movement was careful as they assessed the bear's behavior. It had claimed its kill, which made it dangerous. If it saw them as a threat to its meal, its response would be no hesitation. Sarah raised the rifle slightly, not yet aiming, just preparing in case the situation escalated. But before either could react further, the bear lifted its massive head. In an instant, the grizzly exploded forward, its enormous body covering the distance between them in seconds. Drew and Sarah couldn't move. Their shock was too strong, too real. The beast was upon them instantly, sending them sprawling onto the forest floor. Drew hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs, pain radiating through his ribs as he scrambled to get his bearings. Sarah was thrown in the opposite direction, her rifle slipping from her grasp as she skidded through the undergrowth, a sharp rock gashing her forearm. Before she could even push herself up, the grizzly was there. The weight of the beast was crushing. It pinned her down as one colossal paw swiped across her torso, claws tearing deep into her flesh. She tried to scream, but the pain swallowed the sound whole, her vision blurring from the shock. She fought desperately to push the bear off, but its strength was immeasurable. Drew, still gasping for air, forced himself onto his hands and knees, his mind a whirlwind of panic and survival instinct. He could see Sarah struggling beneath the monstrous bear. The animal's fangs were snapping dangerously close to her face. Adrenaline surged through him, pushing him forward. His hand grasped at the ground, fingers curling around a thick fallen branch slick with morning dew. With every ounce of strength he had left, he swung it, the wood cracking against the bear's side. The impact was enough to draw the beast's attention, though it did little to stop its rage. The grizzly turned, letting out a snarl reverberating through the air as it reared up, towering over Drew like an unstoppable force of nature. He shoved the branch forward, pressing it against the animal's chest in a desperate attempt to keep those lethal claws at bay. The bear swatted at it, snapping the wood as if it were nothing. Sarah forced herself to move despite the agony, her fingers searching through the leaves and dirt until they found the cold metal of her sidearm. Every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her, but she gritted her teeth, ignoring the searing wounds as she lifted the weapon with trembling hands. The bear's attention was still on Drew, its massive body lunging toward him, its weight crashing like an avalanche. Without hesitation, Sarah fired. The gunshot shattered the stillness of the forest. The bullet didn't kill the bear, but did something just as crucial. It startled it. The beast flinched, its enormous frame shuddering as the sound rang through the trees. For the first time, there was hesitation in its movements. It took a staggering step back, its breath heaving, muscles coiled, before it finally turned and retreated into the shadows of the woods. Drew collapsed onto his back, his entire body shaking, lungs fighting for breath. Sarah let the gun fall from her grip, her bloodied hand pressing against her torn side, the warmth of her own life leaking between her fingers. They had survived, but barely. Every inch of them ached, and every breath was a struggle, but they were alive. With their remaining strength, they dragged themselves toward the truck. The radio crackled as Drew reached for it with bloodied fingers, his voice hoarse, each word an effort. Help was coming, but the hours stretched endlessly before them, every second laced with agony, every movement a battle against pain. By the time the rescue team arrived, both officers were barely clinging to consciousness as they were lifted onto stretchers and rushed toward the nearest hospital. The monstrous bear still roamed the woods, its shadow a reminder of the brutal, merciless force of nature that lurked beyond civilization's fragile borders. 76-year-old Margaret Dawson had spent the last 20 years in the same small wooden cabin tucked deep into the woods near a provincial park between Georgian Bay and the Ottawa River, Ontario, Canada, where she had built a quiet life after the death of her husband. She had always been independent, unwilling to trade the solitude of the wilderness for the comforts of city living. And even in her old age, she managed well enough on her own. Her days were simple. She tended to her small vegetable garden, collected firewood, and read by the window as the sun dipped below the trees. Black bears were familiar in the area. They often visited her property, sniffing around her compost pile or rummaging through the undergrowth. However, they had never given her reason to fear them. She had always believed that if left alone, they would do the same in return. But she was wrong. That evening, the air was thick with the lingering scent of the stew she had cooked for dinner, the rich aroma drifting through the open doorway. Margaret had left the door ajar, as she often did, enjoying the fresh breeze that carried the sounds of rustling leaves and distant owls into her home. She had never worried about wild animals venturing too close. After all, she had spent decades living alongside them without incident. She cleared her plate, rinsed her hands in the sink, and moved toward the living room, unaware that something hungry was moving through the trees just beyond the reach of the porch light, drawn by the scent of food. By the time she noticed the animal, it was already inside. The black bear stood just a few feet away, its dark fur blending into the shadows. It sniffed the air, its nose twitching as it searched for the source of the scent that had lured it in. For a moment, Margaret froze, her mind struggling to process the reality of the situation. She had never imagined a bear would enter her home. Her first instinct was to make herself big, wave her arms, shout, or do anything to startle it into retreating. But as she moved, the bear did not hesitate. The animal lunged forward, its weight knocking her off balance and sending her crashing to the wooden floor. It was on her before Margaret could scramble away, its massive paw slamming down against her shoulder, pinning her in place. Terrifying claws raked across her skin, tearing through the thin fabric of her sweater, the heat of her blood spreading beneath her. She struggled, kicking against the floor, trying to free herself, but she was a frail old woman, and the bear was young and hungry. The sound of her heartbeat roared in her ears as the bear lowered its head, its jaws clamping down onto her arm with a terrible force. She heard the bones snap a second before she felt the pain. It began to drag her, its powerful muscles pulling her toward the open doorway. The rough wooden floor scraped against her back as she fought against the inevitable, her free hand clawing at anything she could grasp, chair legs, the edge of a rug, the door frame. But nothing stopped her from being pulled outside. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the bear yanked her down the porch steps. Her body thudded against the ground. She could feel gravel digging into her skin as she was dragged across the yard. The night air was cold against her bloodied skin, but the pain drowned out everything else. The weight of the animal crushed her, its heavy body pressing down against her chest as it tore into her flesh, its claws slicing deep, its teeth snapping bones as if they were nothing. Her screams echoed through the trees, but no one was nearby. The bear would not leave until it had taken what it needed, and it needed to feed. Margaret's struggles weakened, her body trembling from shock, her strength fading as her blood seeped into the dirt. Somewhere in the darkness, the sounds of the forest continued as they always had. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of wind through the trees, the chirp of insects oblivious to the violence unfolding beneath them. The world did not stop for her suffering, and no one came to rescue her. By the time the sun rose, casting golden light through the trees, the yard was silent. The only signs of the night's horror left in the blood-stained ground and the torn remains of Margaret Dawson's clothing. Her body lay twisted among the fallen leaves, almost unrecognizable. The early morning air still carried the faint metallic scent of death. It was not until mid-morning that someone found her. Her nearest neighbor, a man who lived nearly half a mile away, had stopped by to check on her after noticing the back door swinging open, an unusual sight. As he stepped onto the property, the silence felt wrong, heavy, as if the air carried the weight of something terrible. His eyes scanned the yard, searching for movement, for any sign of Margaret, but his breath caught in his throat when he finally saw her. The sight of her battered, lifeless body sent a cold dread through him. his stomach twisting as he took an unsteady step back. The deep gashes that marred her flesh, the unmistakable bite marks, the blood-soaked ground, all of it told the story before he even had time to process it fully. The attack shocked the small community. Black bears had always been a part of life in these woods, but fatal attacks were rare, especially deep in human territory. Officials arrived to investigate, and their warnings about securing homes and keeping food properly stored felt hollow after what had happened. Some argued that the bears were not to blame, that their numbers had grown too large while their habitats had shrunk, forcing them closer to human settlements in search of food. They believed more encounters like this one were becoming inevitable. Others whispered that Margaret had been too trusting and had made a mistake in leaving her door open. Margaret's cabin stood empty, her back door locked, and her once warm home was now another reminder of the dangers lurking in the wilderness. Tom Haggerty had spent the last 20 years behind the wheel, hauling freight across the country, navigating endless highways and empty stretches of land where the only company was the hum of his engine and the occasional sign warning of wildlife crossings. At 53, he was well accustomed to the risks of his job: stiff joints, aching muscles, and the deep fatigue that never quite left, no matter how many hours of sleep he managed between deliveries. He was used to the solitude and the long hours. Whenever he was tired, he would rest on desolate highways before pushing forward again. But nothing had prepared him for what lurked in the darkness one autumn night. The highway was nearly empty as he eased his rig onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching against the loose stones before coming to a stop. The dashboard clock glowed in the dim cab, marking the late hour. He had been driving for nearly 10 hours straight, and exhaustion weighed heavily on him. He needed a break. With a tired groan, he pulled the parking brake, reached for the thermos in the cup holder, and took a final swig of cold coffee before shoving the door open and stepping into the crisp Montana air. The night was quiet, and the stillness made everything feel even more isolated and peaceful. The headlights illuminated the stretch of highway ahead, but beyond that, darkness reigned. Towering pines lined the roadside, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, its lonely call echoing through the emptiness. Tom felt a kinship with the lone animal. The man stretched his legs, rolled his stiff shoulders, and exhaled, grateful for a moment away from the driver's seat. An unfamiliar sound startled him. He turned his head, peering into the darkness, his eyes straining to adjust. At first, he saw nothing, just the endless black of the forest. But then a shape emerged, a hulking figure stepping from the tree line, its massive frame illuminated in the dim glow of his truck's running lights. It was a huge grizzly bear, way bigger than Tom had seen on TV. Its broad shoulders shifted with every step. It kept its head low, watching Tom with caution. The air turned electric with the sudden awareness that he was no longer alone, that something so powerful was watching him. And in that moment, the thin thread of safety he had always felt around his truck snapped. Tom wasn't even surprised when the bear charged. He spun toward the cab, his boots skidding against the loose gravel as he lunged for the door. His fingers grasped the handle, but as he pulled himself inside, the bear slammed into the door with staggering force, the impact so powerful that the metal bent with a deep groan. The door flung open and the bear's teeth sank into Tom's calf, dragging him out of the truck. The bear threw him to the ground as if Tom were nothing but a rag doll. His breath was ripped from his lungs as he hit the ground. By the time he realized what was happening, the bear's claws were already raking across his side, slicing through the thick fabric of his jacket, as though it were paper. A burning pain tore through his flesh, hot blood seeping into his shirt as he scrambled to roll away, his hands digging into the dirt in a desperate attempt to push himself up. But the bear wasn't done. A crushing force clamped onto his leg, the pressure so intense that he thought his bone would snap. The bear's jaws had locked around his calf again, its teeth sinking deep, and when it pulled, agony shot through him, a white-hot fire spreading through his limb as he was dragged backward. He kicked wildly, his boot slamming against the bear's snout, but the creature barely flinched, its grip relentless, its hunger overriding any sense of pain. He knew he had to fight. If he stopped, if he gave in to the searing pain, he wouldn't walk away from this. His hands fumbled in the dirt, searching for anything he could use, and his fingers closed around a loose chunk of gravel. With all his strength, he twisted his body and swung, smashing the rock into the bear's face, striking just above its eye. The impact wasn't enough to cause real damage, but it was enough to make the bear hesitate. Using that brief moment, Tom wrenched his leg free, pain screaming through his muscles as he scrambled backward, kicking against the ground, trying to put as much distance between himself and the beast as possible. Blood streamed down his leg, staining the dirt beneath him, his vision swimming from the sheer exhaustion of the struggle. But the bear wasn't retreating. It shook its head, growled, and lunged again. Then a deafening blast shattered the night. The truck's air horn blared, a long, piercing sound reverberating through the trees, cutting through the silence like a knife. The bear jerked its head up, its ears flattening against its skull, startled by the sudden noise. For the first time it stopped completely, its powerful muscles tensing as it reevaluated the threat. The horn blared again, the deep bellowing sound vibrating through the truck's metal, and something in the bear's primal instincts kicked in. It took a step back, then another, its massive body shifting as it turned toward the trees. Tom barely had time to process what was happening before the bear, with one final huff, disappeared back into the darkness, its heavy footfalls fading into the night. For a long moment, Tom didn't move. He lay there, chest heaving, pain radiating from every inch of his body, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality that he was still alive. His leg throbbed with every heartbeat, his ribs ached, and his hands shook violently as he pushed himself up onto his elbows. He had no idea why the horn went off, none at all. It was either pure dumb luck or a miracle. With every ounce of strength he had left, Tom dragged himself toward the open truck door, his bloodied hands gripping the seat as he hauled himself inside. His body screamed in protest as he collapsed against the worn leather. He slammed the door shut and engaged the locks, his entire body trembling as the weight of what had just happened came crashing down on him. An hour later, emergency responders found Tom slumped in his seat, pain radiating from his wounds, but his heart still beating. He had survived. He was taken to the nearest hospital, where news of the attack spread quickly. Naturally, Tom's encounter sparked debates over the safety of truck drivers who often found themselves alone in wildlife-heavy areas. There was a need for better safety measures, for bear-proof truck designs, for stricter rules about where long-haul drivers could stop for rest. But none of it erased the deep scars that now ran along Tom's side, his leg, his arms, a permanent reminder of the night he had come face to face with death on the side of a lonely highway. The logging camp sat deep in the dense forests of Kodiak Island, where towering trees stretched toward the sky, their thick trunks forming a wilderness wall. For weeks, the crew had been cutting their way through the land, felling trees, stripping branches, and stacking timber for transport. The air smelled of sawdust and gasoline, the constant whine of chainsaws and the heavy thuds of falling trees echoing through the valley. It was dangerous work, but for men like Logan Pierce, it was the only life they knew. Logan had spent decades in the logging industry at 51. His body hardened by years of physical labor, his instincts sharpened by long days in the wild. He was a man of experience, the kind others turned to when things went wrong. Logan never panicked, no matter the situation, but even he failed to see what lurked beyond the tree line that evening. Waiting, watching, its instincts stirred by the scent and sound of men encroaching on its domain. The sun hung low in the sky when the crew began packing up for the day, the golden light filtering through the trees as they shut down their equipment and loaded their gear into the trucks. The forest was quiet now, with only the birds' distant calls and the leaves rustling in the breeze breaking the stillness. Logan wiped the sweat from his brow, rolling his stiff shoulders as he turned toward camp, unaware that something was moving through the undergrowth, creeping closer with each passing second. Then the stillness shattered. A powerful sound ripped through the trees, sending a shockwave through the camp. The man froze in place. Then a colossal shape exploded from the brush, charging. It was an enormous Kodiak bear. Its frame dwarfed even the largest of the men, its thick claws curled, and its eyes locked onto the nearest target, Logan Pierce. Logan cursed as the bear knocked him off his feet. The air was crushed from his lungs, his ribs feeling like they had been snapped in half. The bear reared up, its massive form looming over him, its breath hot against his skin as it let out another deafening roar. Then came the claws. They tore into him with brutal precision, slicing his flesh and muscle like a blade through paper. The pain was overwhelming. Logan's body jerked as the bear's weight pressed down, crushing him beneath it. He tried to fight or at least move, but it was like being pinned beneath a mountain, his strength nothing compared to the raw, unrelenting power of the beast. The others snapped out of their shock, shouts filling the air as men scrambled for their weapons, rifles being wrenched from trucks, safety catches flicked off with frantic hands. A shot rang out, then another, the sharp cracks cutting through the chaos. But the bear didn't stop. Bloodied and frenzied, it lashed out again, its massive paw swiping at Logan's chest, sending another explosion of pain through his already mangled body. His vision blurred, darkness creeping at the edges, the world tilting in and out of focus. Another shot rang out. followed by another in rapid succession. The bear recoiled as a bullet tore into its side. It staggered, its muscles tensing. But instead of retreating, it turned, eyes flashing with primal rage as it lunged at the nearest man. The beast slammed into Rick Carter, a younger logger. The bear's jaws snapped. Rick screamed, writhing beneath the sheer force of the attack, his hands scrambling for anything to shield himself. Owen Armstrong tried to help Rick but was also knocked off his feet. Owen's head hit the ground with a sickening thud, and the man lost consciousness. Another gunshot cracked through the trees, and this time the bullet struck true, hitting the bear in the shoulder. A deep bellow of pain erupted from the animal's throat. It stumbled, blood dripping from its wounds, but its rage wasn't spent. It turned again, eyes wild, nostrils flaring, its massive chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Another shot followed, then another, the bullets tearing into its thick hide, forcing it backward step by step. The men fired relentlessly, their shouts blending with the thunderous cracks of their rifles. The beast stood there for a moment, its massive body heaving, blood staining its golden-brown fur, its wounded shoulder trembling under its weight. It turned, muscles coiling as it pushed itself back into the forest, crashing through the undergrowth until the sound of its retreat faded into the distance. Silence settled over the camp, broken only by the ragged breathing of the surviving men. Logan lay motionless in the dirt, his body torn, his blood pooling beneath him, his breath shallow and uneven. His vision swam, the sounds around him dull and distant, his mind struggling to hold consciousness. Somewhere he could hear voices, could feel hands pressing against his wounds, but the pain was too much, the weight of his injuries dragging him under. And then, Logan was gone. Rick and Owen survived the attack, but their nightmares never left them. The attack shook the logging industry with headlines, calling it one of the deadliest bear encounters in recent history. Experts debated the reasons behind the attack: hunger, territorial aggression, or the increasing overlap between human activity and the bear's habitat. Regardless of the cause, the aftermath was undeniable. Within weeks, new policies were put in place. Armed patrols were stationed at remote logging sites, bear deterrents were installed, and emergency protocols were rewritten to ensure no crew was left unprotected. But for the men who had been there, for those who had fought to survive, no rule or precaution could erase the memory of that day, and nothing could bring Logan back. Deep in the wilderness of Alaska's interior, far beyond the reach of roads and human noise, Peter Griggs lived a life of solitude and survival dictated by the land. At 50 years old, he had spent decades as a trapper, his hands worn and weathered from skinning hides, setting traps and hauling furs through frozen forests. He knew the rhythms of the wild and the importance of respecting the predators that roamed these unforgiving lands. However, experience was not always enough to keep a man safe. Not when nature decided to remind him just how small and fragile he truly was. One evening, Peter returned to his cabin after checking the last of his trap lines, his sled loaded with pelts. He was tired and hungry. Snow clung to his heavy boots as he stomped through the doorway, kicking the door shut behind him, eager to put a warm meal in his stomach before the cold night settled in. His cabin was small but sturdy, a single-room structure with thick logs stacked against the biting wind. A cast-iron stove was in the corner, a cot against the far wall, and shelves lined with supplies. It was not the comfort Peter lived for, but function, survival, and the bare necessities that kept him alive in a land where a single mistake could mean death. He moved through his routine efficiently, hanging his rifle by the door, shrugging off his thick coat, and setting a pot of stew to simmer over the stove. The rich scent of cooked meat and spices filled the cabin, mingling with the fire's smoky warmth. For a brief moment, he allowed himself the luxury of quiet satisfaction, of the simple pleasure of food after a long day. But outside, in the darkness beyond the flickering glow of his cabin, something had already caught the scent of his meal, something that did not care for man's rules. The first sign was the faint rustle outside, a sound too heavy to be a smaller animal. Then came the slow, scraping noise against the wooden walls, a dragging movement, as if something was testing the structure, searching for a way inside. Peter's body tensed immediately, instincts kicking in, his mind sharpening with the recognition of a threat. He turned toward the window just in time to see the enormous head of a grizzly bear pushing through the frame, its powerful shoulders forcing the opening wider, splintering the wooden edges as it hauled its bulk inside. The moment he moved, the bear lunged. It happened fast, faster than any man could react, way before his body could register the sheer enormity of the danger before him. 1 second he was reaching for the rifle, and the next, the bear's massive paw swiped across the room, sending him crashing into the table and the impact rattling the cabin walls. Pain shot through his ribs as he hit the ground. The bear did not stop. It came at him with fury, its heavy body slamming against the furniture, its claws carving deep gouges into the wooden floor as it advanced. Peter scrambled backward, his boots slipping against the floorboards. His mind raced for a plan. Could he come up with anything that could give him a chance? His rifle was out of reach. He had a knife strapped to his belt, but against something this massive, this relentless, a blade was little more than a desperate man's last stand. The bear lunged again, its jaws snapping inches from Peter's face, its breath hot and rank with raw flesh and decay scent. He barely managed to twist away, the claws tearing into his shoulder. Blood ran warm down his arm, his fingers numb as he fumbled for the knife. His grip was weak, and the pain made it hard for him to see. Peter lashed out with little strength, the blade striking the bear's thick fur, cutting deep but not deep enough. The beast roared, a sound so raw it rattled his bones, and then it struck again, its massive paw crashing down and pinning the man to the floor. The weight of the creature crushed him, and his ribs bent under the pressure. This was it. This was the end. Darkness swam at the edges of Peter's vision, the pain dulling, fading, his limbs growing heavy as his strength drained away. The bear's snarling face loomed above him, and it was the last thing he saw before everything went black. When the hunter found him the next morning, the cabin was silent, the air thick with the coppery scent of blood, the floorboards slick with it. The door stood wide open, snow drifted inside, and the wind whistled through the broken window. Peter's body lay in the center of the room, torn and lifeless, his knife still clutched in his stiffening fingers. The bear was gone, vanished into the endless expanse of the wild. The local community of trappers and hunters spoke of Peter Griggs with the respect reserved for men who had lived and died by the rules of the wilderness. Men who knew that every day in bear country was a gamble, that no amount of experience, no years spent reading tracks and learning the habits of the creatures that roamed these lands could ever guarantee survival. The search had stretched into its third day, and the dense backcountry of Montana showed no signs of giving up the missing hiker, a lone traveler who had failed to return from a planned 2-day trek. He had vanished without a trace, leaving only footprints deep into the rugged wilderness before fading into nothing. The search and rescue team, experienced in handling such operations, moved methodically through the thick forest, their radios crackling with updates as they spread out in a coordinated grid pattern. Each of them understood the dangers of the terrain, the hidden cliffs, the fast-moving creeks, the unpredictable shifts in weather, but none of them had expected the real threat that ultimately came for them. Steve Davis, a veteran officer with nearly 15 years of experience in wilderness rescues, led the team through a narrow valley thick with towering pines and dense underbrush. At 43, he was a seasoned professional, his instincts sharpened by years of working in some of the state's most remote areas. His focus was completely on the search. As he walked, his eyes scanned the ground for signs of the missing hiker, and his ears listened for any distant sound that might signal life. But the sound that reached his ears was something entirely different, a deep, rumbling huff, a warning that sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system before his brain could fully process it. Ahead, barely 20 yards away, the bush parted, and a grizzly bear stepped into view. It was a big creature with powerful muscles and dark, dangerous eyes that watched the group with an intensity that sent an unmistakable message. Just beyond it, partially obscured by the foliage, a small cub shifted in the undergrowth, the true reason behind the mother's sudden aggression. Steve knew instantly what they had stumbled into, and his stomach dropped as he made a discreet hand gesture, signaling the others to stop. The team slowed their movements, shifting into a controlled retreat to avoid further provoking the bear. They had been trained for this. They knew not to turn their backs, run, or make sudden gestures that could trigger an attack, but none of it mattered. The bear's instincts had already taken over. The massive creature closed in with a force that made the ground tremble beneath its weight. The bear barreled into Steve, sending him crashing onto the forest floor, with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. He struggled to roll away, to push himself up, but the bear was on him, its massive paw slamming down. Steve could feel its claws slicing across his back. His team moved in to help, their training battling against the sheer horror of what they were witnessing. One officer, Mark Talbot, lunged forward, shouting, waving his arms to draw the bear's attention away from Steve. The bear turned, swinging its massive head, its jaws snapping shut with a deep, bone-chilling growl, before launching itself at Mark, slamming him to the ground with a force that sent leaves and dirt flying into the air. Another rescuer, Aaron Price, barely had time to react before the bear turned again, its rage indiscriminate. She moved to reach for her bear spray, but the beast struck before she could free it from her harness. The animal's claws caught her across the thigh, ripping through her soft flesh, sending her sprawling onto the ground with a sharp cry of pain. Steve, barely clinging to consciousness, felt the bear's weight lift from his back as it turned its attention to the others. Blood ran hot down his skin, pooling beneath him as he struggled to move, to think, to do anything but drown in the pain that radiated through his body with every pulse of his heart. Somewhere in the chaos, he heard the desperate shuffle of boots, the snapping of twigs, and his teammates' short, frantic breaths as they fought against the crazed creature. Then, through the blur of pain and fear, a burst of mist filled the air. The sharp, acrid scent of bear spray cut through the chaos, its chemical sting filling the space between the team and the raging grizzly. The bear reared back, panicked and confused. It stumbled away, trying to escape the burning sensation in its eyes and nostrils. It pawed at its face, huffing and growling, backing away in jerky, uncertain movements before finally turning and crashing back into the undergrowth. The silence that followed was deafening. Steve forced himself to move, his limbs sluggish, his body screaming in protest as he lifted his head, blinking against the sweat and blood that blurred his vision. Mark lay sprawled a few feet away, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His arm twisted unnaturally beneath him. Erin was slumped against a fallen log, her hands pressed against her bleeding leg, her face pale and strained. The rest of the team stood frozen, their bodies rigid with shock, their breaths ragged, their eyes wide with the realization that they had come within inches of death. They wasted no time. With the bear gone, the situation's urgency crashed over them in full force. Radios crackled to life, and voices sharpened with tension as they called for emergency extraction, relaying the severity of their injuries and the need for immediate medical attention. They secured the wounds and moved as quickly as possible through the trees, their minds focused on one thing: getting out alive. The team was barely holding together by the time the rescue helicopters arrived. The attack dominated the news in the following days, sparking debates on the increasing number of bear encounters in the backcountry, whether more precautions were needed, and how search and rescue teams could be better equipped to handle such unpredictable threats. Wildlife officials located the grizzly and her cub days later, tranquilizing the mother and relocating both far from human trails in hopes of preventing another attack. However, Steve and his team had already suffered damage. They had survived, but survival came with a cost, one that would stay with them long after their wounds had healed.